Pretoria studios by our reporter Nozintombi Miya. Good evening, Nozintombi, and welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, Lulu.
Nozintombi, evidence leaders argued that Mr. X's testimony was unreliable. Why did Advocate Gumbi argue for the opposite?
Yes, Lulu, we heard from the evidence leaders last week when they presented their final heads of argument that Mr. X's testimony on the bulk did seem to have quite a number of discrepancies in it in terms of him being able to pinpoint himself from some of the police photos that had come out, as well as him being able to give a proper timeline of events that had happened from the 10th leading up to the 16th. So if the evidence leaders themselves definitely were not sold on the evidence by Mr. X. But you'll remember that Advocate Louis Gumbi is there to represent Warrant Officer Silo Lepako, who was killed by the striking miners in an incident that involved the police on the 13th, which was the Monday of August 2012, and it was near a railway line where the police met with the strikers, and the strikers had asked the police to accompany them to the nearby Kopi. But as police started to accompany them, one of the police officers shot rubber bullets. It then incited the miners to retaliate, and in the ensuing violence, 2 police officers were hacked to death by the strikers. And Warrant Officer Silo Lepaku and Tsiet Simunene were the 2 police officers that were killed by the strikers, and 1 other police officer was injured, but luckily he survived. So Louis Gumbi himself would have to find evidence in whatever Mr. X has said to try and find a way to implicate Mr. X and to find the correct timeline as to who exactly caused the death of his client.
Now, Nozintombi, as you say, Advocate Gumbi also spoke about another witness, Xolani Nzuza, who we know was second in command of the strikers. Why is it important that Gumbi wanted Nzuza's testimony dismissed?
As you rightly said, Xolani Nzuza is one of the strikers who survived that bloodbath on the 16th of August 2012, and his testimony was critical. The families of the 10 people that had died in the days leading up to the 16th had hoped that his testimony would shed some light as to how their loved ones were killed by the strikers, as to who it was that killed their different loved ones. But from his testimony, Xolani Nzuza made a lot of statements where he said that he did not know what was going on at the time. He was merely a striker. He'd only joined the strike on the 10th, and he was joining part of the strikers who were going to the offices, the Lonmin main offices, and he played no role. It was only later, under severe cross-examination, where he recanted his statement and he admitted that he was one of the strikers that was in the top 5, or the group of 5 Amadota, as they call themselves. And his testimony would also be critical for Advocate Louis Gumbi's case, because Xolani Nzuza would then be the only other witness that would be able to explain really what happened on the 13th, because he would have been there with the police by the railway line on the 13th, and he would have then been able to explain what had happened. But since he was unable to say any of that in his testimony, it did ring quite false and it did ring quite untrue. And you'll remember that the evidence leaders last week had already said that Xolani Nzuza's testimony on the main, it was lacking in a lot of information, and it did seem as though that there were quite a lot of untruths in his testimony. That's why Advocate Louis Gumbi then asked for Xolani Nzuza's testimony to be scrapped.
Now, Nozintombi, Lonmin says they were not going to negotiate with an unruly mob, as this would set a precedent. Can you talk us through this and the issue of the influence of having to speak to Cyril Ramaphosa because of his political influence?
Yes, so just to give you a timeline of events. Lonmin, after the 10th, the 11th, the 12th, and the 13th, where 10 people had been killed, Bernard Mokoena at the time, who was one of the senior executives at Lonmin, sent an email to Cyril Ramaphosa asking him to intervene as a member of parliament. And you'll remember that Cyril Ramaphosa then contacted Nathi Mthethwa, who was then police minister, and also Susan Shabangu, who was then Minister of Minerals and Resources. That is the relationship between Lonmin and Cyril Ramaphosa, because he was the executive, he was the non-executive director at the time. So Lonmin has to explain, firstly, why they didn't negotiate with the strikers, regardless of the fact that it was an illegal strike. Had Lonmin had the will to negotiate with the miners, they could have negotiated with the miners, and they could have averted a situation that we saw on the 16th. But because they stayed firm to their position, it's one of the criticisms that Lonmin has faced from a barrage of different legal fraternities, coupled with the fact that they went to the MPs and they asked for Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa's intervention. And they've tried really to give an explanation by saying that, you know, they did what any other business would do to protect their interests. But I really don't think that argument is an argument that will hold a lot of sway with the judges, with the commissioners, with the different lawyers that are present.
Nozintombi, we have to leave it there. We have run out of time. Thank you so much for joining us. That was SABC senior reporter Nozintombi Miya, live from our Pretoria studios, giving us an update on the Marikana Commission.